This week, the 78th session of the UN General Assembly meets in New York City. Beginning Tuesday, heads of state from around the world engaged in what's known as the General Debate. One of those who spoke on Tuesday was the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel. What follows are his comments through a UN translator about the relations between his country and the United States.
Added to the problems and challenges characterizing the reality of our nations and mobilizing peoples are the unilateral coercive measures, euphemistically called sanctions, which have become a practice of powerful states that intend to act as universal judges and to weaken and destroy economies and isolate and subject sovereign states. Cuba is not the first sovereign state against which measures of that sort are applied, but it is the one being subjected to them for the longest period of time, despite world condemnation, which is expressed almost unanimously every year in this assembly, but which is disrespected and goes unheard by the government of the biggest economic, financial and military power in the world. We were not the first, and we're not the last. Pressures to isolate and weaken economies and sovereign states are also today affecting Venezuela, Nicaragua, and both before and after these have been the prelude to invasions and the overthrowing of uncomfortable governments in the Middle East. We reject unilateral coercive measures in countries such as Zimbabwe, Syria, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and Iran, amongst many other countries whose people have been suffering from the negative impacts of these measures. We reiterate our solidarity with the Palestinian cause and support the right to self-determination of the Sahrawi people. Let us all struggle for a world of peace without wars or conflicts. 5 years ago, I spoke for the first time from this rostrum that had been taken before by the historical leader of the Cuban Revolution, Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz and Army General Raúl Castro Ruz, to speak these truths and to speak the ideals of peace and justice of a small archipelago that has resisted and will continue to resist, to live up to the dignity, courage and unbreakable strength of its people and history. But I cannot stand at this global tribune without denouncing once again the fact that for 60 years now, Cuba is suffering from an asphyxiating economic blockade designed to depress its income and living standards, to promote a continued scarcity of food, medicines and other basic inputs, and to damage its development potential. That is the nature and those are the objectives of the economic coercion and the great pressure applied by the United States government against Cuba in violation of international law and the UN Charter. Cuba has not implemented a single measure or action aimed at damaging the United States or its economic sector or its trade or social fabric. Cuba has not engaged in any action threatening the United States' independence, harming their sovereign rights, interfering in its internal affairs, or affecting the well-being of its people. The United States' behavior is absolutely unilateral and unjustified. The Cuban people is resisting and overcoming isolation day after day creatively against this merciless economic warfare, which since 2019, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, was opportunistically escalated to an extreme, cruel and inhumane dimension. The effects are brutal. The United States government is pressuring entities for them not to provide the oxygen of medicine which are needed in Cuba to face the pandemic. Our Cuban scientists created vaccines and developed the ventilators which were needed to save the country and which we put at the disposal of other countries of the world as well. With surgical and vicious precision, they calculated both in Washington and Florida how to inflict the greatest possible damage to Cuban families. The United States continues its actions and has tried to prevent the supply of fuel and lubricants to our country, which would be unthinkable in times of peace. In a globalized world, it is not only absurd, but criminal to prohibit access to technologies, including medical equipment, which have over 10% of United States components. It is shameful their action against the medical cooperation provided by Cuba to numerous nations. It even goes so far as to openly threaten sovereign governments for requesting this contribution and meeting the needs for public health amongst their populations. The United States is depriving its citizens of the right to travel to Cuba, defying its own constitution. The intensification of the blockade has an impact on migratory flows in our country over the last few years, which means a painful cost for Cuban families and has demographic and economic consequences of an adverse nature for the nation. The government of the United States lies and causes great harm to international efforts to combat terrorism when it accuses Cuba, in an utterly baseless way, of being a sponsor of this scourge. Under the shield of this arbitrary and fraudulent accusation, they extort hundreds of banking and financial entities throughout the world and force them to choose between continuing their relations with the United States or maintaining their links with Cuba. Our country is truly under siege. It's suffering from a cruel, silent, extraterritorial economic war. This is accompanied by a powerful political machinery for destabilization, with vast funds approved by the United States Congress, with the aim of capitalizing on the shortfalls caused by the blockade and undermining the constitutional order of the country and its people's serenity. Despite the hostility of this government, we will continue to build bridges with the people of the United States, as we do with all peoples of the world. We will strengthen still further the links with Cuban immigrants in any part of the world. President, promoting and protecting human rights is a shared ideal, which requires a genuine spirit of respect and constructive dialogue between states. Regrettably, 75 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, reality is very different from this. This has become a political weapon for powerful nations who seek to force their geopolitical designs upon independent nations, mainly those from the South. No country is immune from challenges, and none has the authority to consider itself an example in terms of human rights and to stigmatize other models, cultures, or sovereign states. We defend dialogue and cooperation as effective ways to promote and protect human rights without any politicization or selectivity, without applying double standards, conditions, or pressure. In this spirit, Cuba has presented its candidature to the Human Rights Council for 2024 to 2026 in the elections which will take place on the 10th of October. We are grateful in advance for the trust of those countries which have already provided their valuable support. If we are elected, the voice of Cuba will continue to stand up for a universal vision, as seen from the South, of the legitimate interests of developing countries, including constructive commitment and the unavoidable responsibility to the full achievement of all human rights for all. Cuba will continue to bolster its democracy and its socialist model, which, although it is buffeted, has shown what a developing country can do, even if it is small in size and with scant natural resources. We will continue our transformative efforts to seek exits from the siege which is imposed upon us by the United States imperialism and ways to achieve the prosperity with social justice that our people deserves. In this endeavour, we will never renounce the right to defend ourselves. President, distinguished heads of delegation and other representatives, I conclude by extending an invitation to all of you to work to overcome differences and to address shared challenges urgently. To do this, the United Nations and this General Assembly, including with all their limitations, are the most powerful instrument that we have. You can always count upon Cuba to defend multilateralism and together to promote peace and sustainable development for all. It will always be an honour to fight for justice, sharing the difficulties and challenges with the peoples of the South who are ready to change history. We will prevail. Thank you very much.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.